Okay, hi everyone, and hi all the students sitting home, also it's being streamed. So I will talk about grasslands coming up. I was told yesterday, no glasses, no long hair, and no earrings. So at least I'm doing one thing right. Um, so I'm a landscape ecologist. I'm working here at physical geography, but really with plant ecology. So, grasslands. Oh, it's not moving. This is a photograph I took last year in May of a typical semi-natural grassland in Sweden, very close to that picture before with a shore meadow. And with the help of Jessica, who's sitting in the audience, and another colleague, they picked out how many plants we could actually see on this photograph. It's about 50 by 50 centimeters long. Um, and the Swedish semi-natural grasslands are some of the most species-rich habitats in the world. We know that they need a long continuity of management, grassland management, either by mowing or by grazing. It's a long build-up of species, and now they are disappearing. We found 27 different species just from this photograph. If we'd been out in the field, we'd probably been seeing a lot more. And one intriguing question is, where did all these grassland species occur previously, before grassland management? Many suggestions have been that they've been in sort of semi-natural openings along rivers caused by flooding, or ravines, different areas naturally opened. But what I thought when I saw this picture from the Swedish archipelago. This is a photograph taken with 100 years in between, or almost 100 years. And the red cross is exactly the same spot. You can see the land uplift, 40 centimeters of land uplift in 100 years. It's quite a huge amount of grassland actually coming out of the water. So I wanted to model how much grassland that actually potential meadows that came out of the water since people actually started to use grasslands for fodder production. So if you want to read more about the details, it's published now in Proceedings B. But let's start here. Before, after the ice disappeared from this area, we had a water level, sea level of 150 meters above where we sit now. So the land uplift is quite dramatic. And when I explain this in other countries, they haven't even heard about it. So it's quite interesting and we focus on that white dot to the right. I've been told that you can't see on the streaming where we point. So I've tried to do this properly. So we wanted to look at the land uplift for 4,000 years. That's approximately when grassland management became permanent around in this area. So it's upland, north of Stockholm, and Södertörn, just south of Stockholm, that we modeled. So we have a landscape model, a digital terrain model of about 23,000 square kilometers. We had a land uplift model of this area, and this shows when all the lakes became isolated from the sea based on diatoms that colleagues in our department made. Potential meadow areas were picked out where the slopes are between 1 to 2 degrees level, so it's quite flat slope surfaces. So this is a picture how the succession actually works. So you have the sea, then you have the shoreline with grassland, then as soon as the grassland comes out of the water, becomes a bit older, shrubs starts to grow there, and then forest, if this is managed. And then we also looked at the site scale. So grassland, how many species can we find in these grasslands? So we looked at plant diversity in 10 managed grasslands and 10 unmanaged former shore meadows based on historical maps. So I picked out grasslands or shore meadows from these maps from 1901. So the green stuff, that's shore meadow or mowed grasslands. The pink is arable fields, And here the red cross is at the same area. And if you look at this carefully, you can actually see how the land is creeping out in the water, and you get more reeds in the picture of today, the satellite imagery. And when we go out in a managed grassland, you can clearly see the line where the salt actually, even though the Baltic Sea is brackish, you still have an effect of salt and also of storm levels. So maybe you can see this slight undulating line in the picture. So we took a border, that's the border, the sample site. So we actually sampled plots, 1 square meter plots, along these border and towards the sea, one plot close to the sea and one close to the forest or whatever was highest up on this grassland. And some of the results, not surprisingly, we found a lot more species in the grasslands that have been managed. These are all the green dots, also showing a picture from Sandemar, who's one of the biggest shore meadows close to Stockholm that you can visit. It's very popular to go there, not just for the plants, but mainly for the birds in the spring. And below you see an unmanaged grassland. This was a grassland 100 years ago, but now it's just reeds, very few species. And you can also see this on the red dots or brown dots on the graph. You can also see how grassland or plant diversity increase with the relative age when this grassland is coming out of the water. So a few species in the beginning, close to the water, and then it starts to become more and more. And what we saw was that the animals, they're very effective in spreading the species around in this grassland. So cows, they can disperse a lot of seeds. One example is that during one season, they can disperse 96,000 seeds of Campanula rotundifolia, liten blåklocka, just for one season. So you can imagine if you have a couple of cows walking around on this grassland, they trample down the reeds, they create small surfaces where the seeds can develop, with the hoofs, and also where they actually spread out their poo. So they're very good at dispersing seeds and also manage the grassland. But what about, this is now, what's happening now, the last maybe 100 years. If we start with the land uplift model, so 4,000 years of land uplift, the red is the recently land coming out, and the blue is the further 4,000 years ago. The black is where we don't have a land uplift during these age. And what we saw, I've zoomed in a bit. You can see some of the islands. Svartlöga, I know one of the students know this very well. You can see that that's a quite young island. A lot of that island has come out of the sea. So almost 8,000 square kilometers came out during these 4,000 years. And out of these, around 3,000 square kilometers were potential grassland coming out. About 50 to 150 square kilometers per 100 years. And the land uplift, obviously, it's slow sometimes, it's quicker at certain levels, depending also how the sea level changes over time. But this is quite striking, how much potential grassland came out of the water. We know from historical records that this grass was very sought after for the farmers. It's slightly salty, so people even traded grass from shore meadows to other areas. Now we put out salt licks to the animals instead, but this salted grass was well sought after. So we think that most of this grassland were actually managed. Obviously, once the grassland becomes older, becomes a dry grassland or dry grassland, then you have forests starting to encroach. But it still shows that this might be one of the areas where these species occurred before grassland management. And a bit about what's happening today. During the last 100 years, about 80 square kilometers shore meadow came out of the sea. That's equivalent of Lidingö, one of the islands in Stockholm. But today we only manage 0.3 square kilometers. Despite that these grasslands are so important for birds, for plants, also for breeding, for many amphibians, fish, and so on, it's still just a fraction compared to the dry semi-natural grasslands in the same area that we manage today. That's 265 square kilometers. So this is really, really important to manage. And what we found when we looked into the species, that the managed semi-natural grasslands that we still have left have disproportionately a lot of red-listed species, rare species, that are now declining. So a bit about the future, the conclusion. So we combined both physical geography, land uplift model to try and disentangle where these species were in the past, and also how much this grassland management is important for species. And so we can conclude that animals are really important for the present day species richness. But what about the future? I put out a very coarse picture how much SMHA described that the water level will rise in the future. So that's 67 centimeters, 2,100. So it's not looking very good for these shore grassland meadows. The sea level rise will outcompete the land uplift, so we will actually have a sea level rise in the future. So we need to think about this. We need to restore areas above. I doubt they want to cut down Tullgarn forest, but maybe other places where the species actually can move up again, because it will be just slivers of semi-natural grassland shore meadow in the future if we don't do anything about it. And that was me.
Thank you very much, Sara. It's a really nice mix of physical geography and ecology, and also including the Ice Age, which we like. Okay, so we have a first question up here.
Thanks, Sara. Do you also look at beta diversity?
Yes.
So does it matter where the grasslands come from? Do they have different pathways? And is it, because that is maybe good for argumentation later on, that someone says like, yeah, maybe you just preserve that one meadow?
Yeah,
we
actually looked into sort of local scale diversity and compared the different grasslands between the different grasslands, the 10 we looked into. And yes, they're quite different. But some species, they're only occurring there, and you see them in all the grasslands. And what we think is when you have this enormous areas of grasslands coming out, wild animals, livestock, people cut the grass, so then the species would have spread out more efficiently. But now we can see, like, for example, Cousins lilia on that picture. It doesn't occur on all the semi-natural grasslands, but just on a few ones. So obviously, if that disappears, that species disappeared too.
So, Sara, I have a question to you. It looks like your colleagues are telling you that the sea level, the land uplift can be kind of variable from place to place.
Yes.
And also that it look to me that the change or difference quite big, because you do see that some of the land will disappear. On the average, the global sea level, it will be increased like 3 millimeters a year. And in Stockholm in general, I think the land lift should be around 4 to 5 millimeters per year. So your picture here shows that some of the regions can be, land lift can be lower than.
Oh yeah.
Is that
So the sea level, the predicted sea level rises will sort of the land uplift can't compensate.
Mm-hmm.
So this zero line is moving further north with sea level.
But just some regions, not everywhere.
No, obviously Höga Kusten up north. I don't know when that sea level rise will.
That is far much
Yeah.
bigger than Stockholm. Yeah.
Yeah, but obviously it depends also on the topography of the land. So, for example, the south area where we looked into, the topography is much steeper. So you obviously don't get as much shore up. But on a very flat area like Tullgarn, there's quite a lot of grassland coming out every year, as you saw on that picture, the photographs from 100
Very,
years
very
ago.
interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so one quick final question, and I guess perhaps Rienk can start moving up.
There is one question from the internet, and it says, how was the limit when you spoke about brackish water relevance?
How was the limit? We have some species that are very sensitive to salt water, so they won't grow where the salts, the sort of brackish water comes out of the sea, where it touches the land. So it's a very clear vegetation limit, and also you have effects of storms and reeds, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. So an applause for Sara while we switch to the next speaker. So now we're back to streaming again, I think. I should stand here. So I'm happy to present the next speaker, Amelie Lindgren from the Department of Physical Geography, who's going to take us back in time again. We have another ice age perspective. And Amelie's going to tell us about Northern Hemisphere soil carbon stocks from the last glacial maximum to the pre-industrial.
Yes, thank you. And Gustav is also mentioned on this presentation because he's also he's my supervisor, and he's a great supervisor, by the way. And he's also involved in this project, of course. So yes, we're talking about a changing environment and a changing climate. And what is a better sort of deal to look at than the change from the last glacial maximum until now? Talk about a regime shift. So it's all about this, what I'm going to talk about. This is many curves, but if you look at the pink one, that's carbon dioxide from about 30,000 years ago until now-ish. The blue one is temperature. Those are pretty closely related to each other here. So as the world warms, the carbon dioxide also increases, or the carbon dioxide increases and the world warms. The green one is carbon-14. I'm not going to talk so much about that, but there is an interesting period here where it rapidly decreases, or it sort of sinks, and that means that there is some kind of old carbon being flushed into the atmosphere. The gray curve is the carbon-13, which is a very good signifier between carbon that has been sort of going through the something biotic, as in plants don't like to take up this carbon-13, so it preferentially chooses carbon-12, which means that when it respires carbon, it is lighter. And this is very important because that means that when the carbon-13 does weird things, as it does around 15,000 K, and then increases, it means that something is happening with probably terrestrial carbon. This curve also shows that carbon has to have been somewhere during the glacial. The atmosphere had less carbon during the glacial. And if you think about it, that means that, okay, it wasn't in the atmosphere, and it probably, was it on land? I mean, you had a much colder and drier environment. So possibly then, was it in the ocean? Was it more carbon in the ocean, both from the atmosphere and the land? Or was it different? I'm going to make a case for the possibility that the land, at least, thank you for saving me from advertising, might actually have played a role at least. And what we did look at was Well, the possibility of permafrost having maybe a role. So this came out a few years ago, and it's a little bit of like a permafrost hypothesis. So that permafrost thaw might have been like a catalyst for the deglaciation. I'm not sure that we're all sort of agreeing on this, but it's sort of important that it points out that we are looking for a specific type of pool of carbon that was released into the atmosphere. And the isotopic signals tells us that it was old because the carbon-14 is very, very depleted. And it was also depleted in carbon-13, so it was probably terrestrial. And a large glacial permafrost pool sort of fits these criteria. So we then started to reconstruct this permafrost carbon pool to see, if, okay, is this really possible? Was the carbon sort of hidden from the atmosphere in the permafrost? So we reconstructed biomes for the last glacial maximum. We reconstructed areas of, well, we reconstructed the carbon storage in loess soils, which are very important today, especially when they're frozen, and in peat. And we also checked into the possibility of maybe an ice sheet burial of carbon. And we published this in August this year. And the results were, well, it showed that we had some changes had occurred in the system if we compared the last glacial maximum with present. If you look just at the dark gray, that's the permafrost carbon storage. If you look at the separate sides, you could possibly see that the permafrost storage at least has decreased until now. So the permafrost storage is less. But actually, because of some effects of, among others, peat soils, there's more carbon in this system today. So the total on the right side is actually higher. It's about 300 petagrams larger. And what this also shows is that there must have been some type of transient changes. It's not only been gains or losses, it's been gains and losses in different compartments. So we've gained a lot of organic soils, peat soils, but we've lost other types of soils, like the loess soils. Or carbon in loess, not the loess soils themselves, because they're still there. But we wanted to look into this in more detail. So that's where I'm at now, and these are very, very, very new results. I was sitting with this on Tuesday. So the graphs are going to be beautiful Excel graphs. But what this shows here are biome area changes in the northern hemisphere, about north of 23 degrees. And I want you to look at the light blue line. That's the tundra. That decreases quite a lot between, well, from 21K up until now. The dark green, that's the boreal forest, that increases quite tremendously. So we have these shifts in between biomes, for instance. And what does that mean for carbon storage? Well, one thing, I did calculate roughly the carbon storage with very preliminary, tentative sort of transfer functions for the carbon storage. So please don't hold me to these numbers. They're going to change, most definitely. But it shows in the sort of dashed line that the carbon storage, well, these results actually show that there might have been higher at one point than they are now. But there's definitely a change in the system, and it's not linear. Something is going on. It's increasing and then decreasing and then increasing again. So whatever it is we're looking at, we're definitely not looking at something that is linear or that is going in line with the temperature increase or anything like that. This is something different. And this is also not taking into account that maybe when one system shifts into another, there might be even more changes. We don't really know. these only capture the carbon storage here is just the net effect. I've not looked into the spatial changes. So what happens when the boreal forest actually encroaches on the tundra, for instance. So the spatial changes are not included here. I'm not sure they will be, but it's just food for thought. So the biomes, if you remember from my maps, that was sort of one of the things, but we also have the loess soils, for instance, and the peat, and we have the ice sheets. We've done some calculations on the loess so far. We have not included the peat yet, but we've also done the carbon burial under ice sheets. So this next figure is a quick sort of well, take together of these three. The losses are negative here, so the gains are positive numbers. The gray is these biome changes that I've talked about. The dark blue are the loess soils. And we have massive losses in carbon from these loess soils in these very preliminary results. I'm ordered to say that they're preliminary. And we also have some more minor losses from these ice sheet burial. And what this tells us here, at least in this figure, if we're still just looking at the left one, is that we have lost a lot of carbon from the terrestrial biosphere. And peat soils are not included here, which means that when those are included, it's going to be gains, much more gains, maybe even making up for the losses that we've made. But let's focus on the losses first. Loess soils have been very, very important here. If we look at the right picture, it's a figure that shows results from a carbon-13 study. It was not only about carbon-13, but it was looking at these differences in, well, what happens between the LGM and now? Where does the carbon come from? And what they've looked at is when was it additions into the atmosphere from carbon-13 enriched sources, and when was it from depleted sources? And so I like to pair these up a little bit. That figure on the right suggests that we had massive increases, or the biosphere contributed to something before 16K. That's the dark gray there. We don't see that at all in our numbers. Nothing. We have gains during that time. So no similarities whatsoever at 16K. When we come to 12, though, around between 15 and 12, we have these losses, especially from these loess soils. Those align fairly well with also, again, these 13C depleted sources into the atmosphere. It's not possible to draw a connection between these two yet, but it's sort of nice to show there might be something there. So in the end, why we're doing this and what our results sort of will mean is hopefully to further push the modelers to look at the terrestrial, well, land in general as something that has been dynamic over the last glacial maximum until now. Land has been a player, and it has both gained carbon, it has lost carbon. And modelers need to sort of acknowledge that when they want to actually model what has happened. So the ocean is not only sort of the only thing that is going on and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, but the land is doing at least something. And maybe our results sort of point that land may have contributed more to these changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide than we previously thought. It's mostly been focused on the ocean so far as the major contributor, but land has definitely done something. And we can't explain these dynamics around 16K yet. We don't really know what our results will look at the end, but it lines up with, you know, the ocean people that really wants to point to a source of carbon from the southern Antarctic Ocean at this point. Yeah, I think that was mostly what I was trying to say. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Amelie. And I see right away Christian
Yes.
was waving immediately.
Please, Christian.
So here comes Oprah.
Yeah, thank you for this, these nice new results also. I just wonder about this time 16K
Yeah?
and these preliminary results where you
Yes.
showed these different ecosystems. No, further back.
You want
yeah,
this
here,
one? Yeah.
So when you say tundra and boreal forest, where is the permafrost area?
Yeah,
here?
we have not included the permafrost area yet, which is one of the sort of major preliminary parts of this. We have not been able to yet really set, you know, our foot down and say these are the permafrost area changes between these periods. So it's not yet included. So these are very, very preliminary results. And
So tundra, of course, includes the permafrost area, but there's
Yeah.
a lot of permafrost
yeah,
where
in
you
the
have
boreal forest. Yeah. So right now in this figure, all the boreal forest is tundra, and that's not true. But those are the carbon values that I've used.
Okay,
So this will change massively.
okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions for Amelie? We've got lots of time.
Yeah, I was quick as usual.
Thank you for a very nice talk, Amelie. I was just curious. You see a big loss from the loess
Yes.
soils. Can you explain that? Like why with the loess soils there?
Well, our assumption, well, we have looked into these soils and in a frozen state, when they're permafrost, they sort of accumulate carbon in our, with the data that we can see. So loess is, well, they have this accumulative nature, and then they bury sort of their carbon and their vegetation, and they have permafrost, and it sort of keeps the carbon in there. But when the permafrost thaws, the carbon sort of vanishes almost instantly. I would like to know so much more about these loess soils so that I could tell you more in detail. But this is a pretty rigorous, these results are from a pretty rigorous literature study of whatever is out there when it comes to loess and carbon. Unfortunately, researchers looking into loess are not very interested in carbon. So it's quite few results, but this is what sort of...
Yeah, but to me they are very inorganic. Soils.
Yeah, exactly. They're very inorganic soils. But when they're in a frozen state, like permafrost, the assumption is that they have more carbon and that we can sort of...
Thank you.
Thank you, Amelie, for this nice presentation. Another follow-up question on the loess. Would those ice complex deposits in Siberia also associate with your classification as loess?
Oh, you mean the Yedoma?
The Yedoma.
Well, nothing happens with the Yedoma here because it's not included in any loess soils that are actually changing. Yedoma is just static here.
Okay, that's true.
So it's actually not included. The losses here are the loess soils that are in the within the zones that actually thaws out. So the Yedoma is not included.
Another quick question. Does this model consider the sea level change?
Yes.
Perfect.
And the ice sheet retreats. I didn't say that. But, yeah, so the areas for these biomes both include the ice sheet retreat and the sea level rise, but they're also at the same time not realistic yet because we assume that as soon as the ice sheet retreats, we have a full carbon storage of that biome. It's not going to be like that when we have the final calculations.
Any more questions? Okay, I'm just going to belabor the loss again, and I realize it's from a literature survey, but do you
Yes.
have any idea the thickness of the deposits that are included in that?
Oh, it's different. The thickness of the deposits are, of course, depending on where the deposits are.
Mm.
The U.S. deposits are really, really thick.
Mm.
The same with the European ones in some areas. So the thickness is definitely included in there.
Mm.
So it's for the full deposit. Yes.
All right, any more questions for Amelie? And if we could thank her one more time. Thank you. And he'll be talking to us again about more carbon. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Today I would like to talk about carbon use efficiency, which is a measure of how well systems retain carbon. Let me start by acknowledging support from Research Area 4 of the Bolin Center to a flagship project titled Scaling Carbon Use Efficiency from Organisms to the Global Scale. We had several outputs from this project, both articles and data sets published in the Bolin Center database. But today I would like to focus on one of these papers, the one published in Biogeosciences earlier this year. So what is carbon use efficiency? Carbon use efficiency can be broadly defined as the ratio of carbon retained in a system over the carbon entering that system. And you can see a schematic up here showing what it means. You can think of carbon use efficiency for many different types of systems, plants, animals, microbes, or entire ecosystems, or soils, or sediments. You can think even about your own carbon use efficiency. If you can quantify how much of the carbon you eat actually remains in the new cells, and how much is released through feces and respiration. Now, clearly, the interpretation of this ratio, this carbon use efficiency, varies depending on the system you're looking at. And depending on the system, various methods are actually used to estimate this ratio. Also, the interpretation varies depending on the discipline that you're looking at. In plant sciences, carbon use efficiency is defined maybe differently compared to microbial ecology, for instance. So this leads to a huge number of definitions for carbon use efficiency, and many papers actually describing how carbon use efficiency varies within a certain discipline or within a certain system. And let me emphasize that people are interested in why carbon use efficiency varies for several reasons, and the obvious one is that being it a measure of how well systems retain carbon, it's also a measure of potentially carbon storage in that system. Now, the problem with so many definitions is that it's really hard to compare them. We have here a list of the definitions that we find applied to systems ranging in complexity from individual organisms to communities and ecosystems. And these definitions are valid for plants, microbes, or whole ecosystems, as I mentioned, or animals. So they are all a little bit different, but they also have some commonalities. So the main scope of this contribution is to actually find commonalities across all these definitions, find general patterns, and find a mathematical structure that actually allows us bridging gaps across disciplines and across scales. And indeed, we are talking about a very broad range of scales, because carbon fluxes that ultimately define carbon use efficiency are measured and interpreted at very different scales in time and space. So how do we start? We can start from a simple carbon balance equation. The changes in carbon storage through time depend on inputs minus outputs. It doesn't get any simpler than that. Then here we can define an apparent carbon use efficiency as the conversion factor from inputs to storage changes, so that we can actually write now the mass balance equation for carbon as this apparent carbon use efficiency times the input, which with some algebra leads to this first definition of efficiency as 1 minus output over input. So if the output is large compared to the input, we can even have negative carbon use efficiency. But if the output is very, very small, we actually have much more storage of carbon in the system and carbon use efficiency close to 1. And everything else in the middle. Generally speaking, larger outputs compared to the inputs decrease carbon use efficiency and potentially long-term storage. Now, this is very simple, and in fact, this definition is often used in practice when people measure input and outputs and therefore calculate an efficiency. But it doesn't have a very, very strong physical or biological meaning because these fluxes of input and outputs are not well defined. So to proceed, we need to better define these fluxes. And we can start doing that from individual organisms or communities of either heterotrophs or autotrophs. For these biological systems, our mass balance equation or carbon balance equation now can be written as an uptake rate minus egestion, exudate, production, respiration, and turnover, where turnover depends on senescence and mortality, and I'm putting these two together. So you can think of this carbon uptake being distributed in different ways. A lot of carbon is lost, some is remaining as net growth of the organism or the community you are considering. Now in this context, we can define an actual carbon use efficiency that converts carbon inputs into biosynthesis, mainly growth, but in some cases also exudation. Now this leads to a definition of carbon use efficiency at the bottom of the slide that now accounts for more specific processes happening at the organism or community level. Now the carbon use efficiency is defined as 1 minus egestion plus respiration terms divided by carbon uptake. And I also subdivided the respiration terms depending on whether respiration is for growth, maintenance, or overflow. But without going too much into the details, the bottom line here is that when respiration increases compared to uptake of carbon, carbon use efficiency decreases and the organism allocates less carbon to growth and more to losses. And this definition can be reformulated to match different types of organisms. Again, autotrophs, microorganisms or animals, they all have slightly differences, but despite these differences, we can use this single definition for all of them. And doing some algebra, it turns out that the apparent carbon use efficiency I defined earlier is actually related to this actual carbon use efficiency. And the formula, you can see it at the bottom of the slide, basically tells us that if there is a lot of turnover, so senescence or mortality, the apparent carbon use efficiency is going to be much lower than the actual carbon use efficiency. And this creates a first expectation generated by the simple mathematical framework we proposed, that the turnover decreases the apparent carbon use efficiency. And this is indeed the case, as you can see from these two examples, which deal with the microbial systems, so soil microbial systems, in two different studies where turnover was manipulated by basically changing the density of microbial predators in the soil sample. So high turnover causes the apparent carbon use efficiency to decrease. Now remember that most colleagues actually use the definition of apparent carbon use efficiency to estimate the actual carbon use efficiency. So from here you can see that if turnover is high, you will get relatively low apparent carbon use efficiency, while in fact the actual carbon use efficiency could stay high. So there is a methodological issue that is clearly highlighted by this formula, and it is probably confounding some of the patterns that have been found. Recent papers in Nature have shown that carbon use efficiency might decrease with increasing temperature, for instance. I'm referring here to soil microbial carbon use efficiency, with implications for carbon storage at the global scale. But perhaps these changes in carbon use efficiency with temperature are in fact caused by changes in turnover, not the actual carbon use efficiency. Now, The formulas I showed before also create a second expectation that increasing respiration compared to carbon inputs decreases carbon use efficiency. And this is also the case, as you can see from these two examples, one for plants and one for soil microbes. As the plants get older, they stopped actively growing towards the end of the growing season. They set seeds, and therefore they allocate carbon mostly to respiration, with the result of lower carbon use efficiency. And for microbes, on the x-axis, you can see how substrates are being depleted through time, and as a result, carbon use efficiency decreases. Because microbes without much substrate, without much food to eat, grow less, they keep respiring, and their efficiency goes down. Now there is also another pattern that we can identify. Generally, complex organisms, multicellular and large organisms, consume more carbon for maintenance of their complex structure compared to the carbon they take up. As a result, we expect carbon use efficiency to decrease from simple organisms to more complex organisms. And this is indeed the case, as you can see in this data set published a few years back. But again, this is something we can easily see in the mathematical framework that we proposed. And finally, when we move from organisms to whole communities, we can also expect carbon use efficiency to decrease. So if you look at a single organism, and many of us are doing that, often you look at an organism that is actually growing relatively fast. In a whole community, there are organisms growing fast at high efficiency and others that are growing slowly and are generally less efficient. So when you move from an organism to a community, by averaging, you actually end up with a lower overall carbon use efficiency. And this is actually what's happening in both the plants and heterotrophic organisms. As you can see in the plot on the left, carbon use efficiency decreases from the leaf level to the whole plant level to the community level. And the same goes for the plot on the right, showing how the carbon use efficiency of microbial isolates is higher than the natural microbial communities, which and also higher compared to animals, so much larger organisms with much more complex metabolism. So bottom line here, before moving to the whole ecosystem level, higher costs for maintaining complex structures results in lower efficiency, and also averaging effects when moving from individual organisms, fast growing, to whole communities also results in lower efficiency. Now, moving up to one level of complexity to the whole ecosystem. Now we have both autotrophs and heterotrophs interacting, right? So carbon enters the ecosystem through gross primary productivity, or GPP. Part of this carbon is respired by plants, autotrophic respiration, and part is actually used to build new biomass, and that would be the net primary productivity. But net primary productivity ends up in the end in soils and sediments, and here let me point out, I'm discussing a general ecosystem, could be terrestrial or aquatic. Okay, it's a general picture. So NPP eventually enters the sediment system where it's processed by microbes, heterotrophic respiration is generated, there is some recycling internally, and eventually some carbon can be actually stored. And that's what is often referred to as the NECB, net ecosystem carbon balance. Now, for this particular system, we have a carbon balance written as GPP minus respiration, from which we can estimate carbon use efficiency as the net ecosystem productivity, or GPP minus respiration, over GPP. That's a common definition often used in the literature. And this turns out to be equal to the carbon use efficiency of the autotrophs, minus a second term that you can see at the bottom of the slide, including respiration of the heterotrophs and GPP. What does this formula tell us? That plants might have a certain carbon use efficiency, this autotroph CUE, but when you have also microbes in the system, their respiration is actually decreasing this efficiency to lower values for the whole ecosystem. And when we look at data, this is actually the case. So I'm plotting here in green net primary productivity as a function of GPP. And I put in a line here, a regression line, the slope of which represents the carbon use efficiency of the autotrophs, vegetation. Okay. I also added gray points with a red regression line indicating net ecosystem productivity. So that's the ecosystem level productivity as a function of GPP. Now the slope of the red line is much smaller compared to the slope of the green line, showing that the efficiency at the ecosystem level is smaller compared to the efficiency of the autotrophs alone. And this is explained again by our formula there. The last step is adding abiotic fluxes, transport of carbon in and out of the ecosystem. And these fluxes are denoted by these F in and F out symbols. Now that we have these additional fluxes, the definition of carbon use efficiency changes slightly. We can jump to the end at the bottom left of the slide, and instead of having only respiration and GPP, now in the formula we also have abiotic fluxes out of the system and abiotic fluxes entering the system. So what is this formula telling us now? That both biological outputs and abiotic outputs matter, and both biological inputs and abiotic inputs matter when we define this carbon use efficiency. Now the problem is in most cases, these abiotic fluxes are not measured. They are harder to measure. So generally people calculate carbon use efficiency as 1 minus respiration over GPP, forgetting about these fluxes, which is generally fine in terrestrial systems where abiotic fluxes are relatively small, but that's not the case in aquatic systems where you have a lot of transport of carbon entering a system. Think about a lake. Rivers carry organic carbon into the lake, and some of it actually exits also the lake in the water. But a lot of this alloctonous carbon is actually respired in situ. That means that if you forget about this F in and F out, you measure a very high respiration, perhaps low GPP, think again about a lake, you end up with negative carbon use efficiencies. And that's what most aquatic system carbon use efficiency values look like. They are negative. This is again a problem related to how the efficiency is estimated. In terrestrial systems instead, efficiencies are relatively higher. Can you help me with the advertisements? Sorry, I have one slide left. Bad timing. Oh, thank you. Right. So to conclude, there are many definitions of carbon use efficiency. They can be synthesized using a simple mathematical framework based on mass balance equations. That was our main goal in this contribution. And using this framework, we came up with a number of expectations that are actually generated by the formulas of the framework, specifically that turnover and respiration tend to decrease carbon use efficiency, but also that carbon use efficiency decreases with increasing level of complexity in organisms, and also carbon use efficiency at the whole ecosystem level is lower compared to the carbon use efficiency of the plants alone because of the heterotrophic contributions. And finally, that ecosystem carbon use efficiency is underestimated when it's calculated without accounting for alloctonous carbon inputs into the system, particularly relevant in aquatic systems. That's it on my end.
Thank you, Stefano. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
So how do you deal with changes? So this all assumes steady state or not?
No, not necessarily. The definition is general. You can think of this carbon use efficiency as kind of a partitioning coefficient. At any instant in time, it tells how much carbon goes one way or the other. So in fact, it's implemented like that in most biogeochemical models, but also models describing animal growth or microbial growth or plant growth. So it's an instantaneous concept. The problem is that measurements are not instantaneous. So there is an integration time which determines the time scale at which we can interpret carbon use efficiency.
So thanks for a very interesting talk. So you said at the organism level, the carbon use efficiency decreases with increased biological complexity.
Yeah.
Would you expect this to also, if you think of going from the organism to an ecosystem, would you expect it to, does it decrease when biodiversity or biological complexity of the ecosystem as such increases, or does that?
That's an excellent question. I haven't really thought about it, but I would say not necessarily. It depends on how diversity plays out. I mean, if a very diverse system is a system that uses resources more efficiently because of niche complementarity, for instance, perhaps carbon use efficiency would actually be higher in a more diverse system. It's hard to say. If you push a system towards very, very high productivity, like agricultural systems, then low diversity actually is related to also, I would say, lower efficiency, because oftentimes systems that are pushed to produce a lot, they have intrinsically lower efficiency. So I'm not sure. This is something that would be actually interesting to look at.
Okay, do we have any last questions for Stefano? No? All right, let me give another round of applause.